In global climate governance, transparency is increasingly at the center of attention. Transparency in the form of reporting and review is even considered to be the backbone of the Paris Agreement on climate change. But does transparency in practice deliver benefits and help further climate action? This is a core question the 5-year TRANSGOV research project has been addressing. Now we enter an exciting new phase where we explore how our research can make an impact.
This is the NWO Impact project that brought us here to Ethiopia. So we were really trying to see how our research findings from the TRANSGOV project so far resonate in the Ethiopian context, and whether we can bring these findings and insights to a group of practitioners who are actually engaging with transparency. So, and that in that way, try to have the kind of science for impact by introducing a number of critical questions about the relevance of these transparency arrangements in the Ethiopian context. And we did this by organizing a national multi-stakeholder dialogue with more than 30 climate policymakers and transparency practitioners.
Parties to dialogue on the Wageningen University Transparency Research Centers. And
the question is that there's very little empirical evidence of whether these promises are being realized in practice. So is transparency delivering on all of these promises? And that's our point of departure.
After the opening remarks, we started our first interactive session of the workshop. We asked participants the question, why has Ethiopia engaged? And what has this engagement delivered in practice? The second interactive session was about looking ahead at how Ethiopia might engage in the future to ensure it leverages benefits and minimizes burden. Are the UNFCCC transparency arrangements fit for purpose? Or is there a need to reimagine these arrangements? Right now, we just completed our workshop questioning the status quo, exploring Ethiopia's engagement in UNFCCC transparency arrangements, and we had a wonderful attendance of over 30 people, including policymakers and implementers in the climate change field, with many of them closely involved in the writing of Ethiopia's transparency reports. We were also lucky to have the state minister at our event, sharing his views on Ethiopia's engagement in UNFCCC transparency arrangements.
I realized that the transparency is very useful for the Ethiopia can be benefited from that in getting resource mobilization and implementing its climate action.
If you look at the last 3 national communication reports, the focus is on the mitigation, but rather than focusing on the mitigation, the content should have national circumstances, mitigation, adaptation, as well as the finance.
The main takeaway for me is transparency is important for an effective implementation, particularly for the climate finance related programs.
The impact of this workshop is very high.
Very engaging.
It has enabled me to reflect on what I should do regarding transparency.
In transparency, let us join hands to fight against climate change.
One striking insight is that there are a lot of benefits to engaging with these UNFCCC transparency arrangements from those who are involved in these arrangements. But the wider ecosystem of climate policy is not necessarily convinced about how these reports and all of this transparency feeds into domestic policy processes.
What it really shows is that this transparency report should not be generated by a few transparency experts, but rather it should be inclusive, considering gender and other aspects, including other development experts and broad climate policymakers, so that it becomes much more the voice of most of Ethiopians rather than a few.
So we are here at this very impressive African Union building, where we just had a very insightful conversation about climate policy in Africa and the role for reporting in that.
We exchanged views on whether the enhanced transparency framework is in fact fit for purpose and aligned with priorities of the global south and the African continent in particular. Today we are at the Ethiopian Ministry of Planning and Development, and this ministry is responsible for writing the transparency reports to the UNFCCC, and today we learn more about how Ethiopia goes about this and what it hopes to gain out of this process.
We also met with the State Minister from the Ministry of Planning and Development, the Organization of Southern Cooperation, as well as various development partners such as GIZ and the Embassy of the Netherlands.
These transparency arrangements are not just a technical exercise, they should be they're a global obligation for Ethiopia. Ethiopia is very committed to meeting its global obligations, but at the same time they should be leveraged for political negotiations with donors. The government should use these international obligations to try to further domestic priorities and to realize the political potential in transparency as well.
As mentioned in the beginning of this video, at the global level, transparency is increasingly central to climate governance, and there's lots of push on countries like Ethiopia to improve their reporting system and to fully engage. And lots of time and resources go into this. We as TRANSGOV try to question the status quo and take a step back and critically reflect on what this reporting delivers for Ethiopia and rethink how such engagement might be reconfigured to deliver domestic benefit. And taking this step back and posing these critical questions and entering this dialogue with policymakers is the way in which we as TRANSGOV try to make an impact.